Do you ever feel like your progress as an improviser is stuck? You've been doing all the things you should, practicing your scales, your arpeggios, learning tunes, learning different licks, but when it comes time to actually perform, rather than feeling like spontaneous creation, it feels like you're just playing scales, arpeggios, and licks. Today, we're going to look at 3 different practice techniques that can help you get unstuck and turn that foundational information that you've been practicing so diligently into more meaningful and satisfying solos. What's up, everyone? Glad to be back this week talking about some improvisational stuff after a few lessons talking about sort of recording techniques and that sort of thing. As always, anything that you hear today, if you're interested in checking it out in a little more in-depth fashion, maybe with a handout with some written examples, an additional practice video where we really work through some of this stuff, check it out in the virtual studio. The link is down in the description. I try not to bother y'all with that stuff too much, but I do think there are some great resources there if you are on this journey of becoming a better improviser. So all of us go through these periods where our playing sort of stagnates and we kind of reach a plateau where we've been working on things, but it just maybe feels like they aren't coming out in our playing, or our playing sort of feels like that's all we can play. Maybe you've been practicing arpeggios a lot. Your solos sound like arpeggios, or maybe you've been playing a certain 2-5-1 lick a lot, trying to get in all 12 keys. That lick starts to come out in your playing whether you want it to or not sometimes. It seems like that's the only lick you can hear. So the things we're going to talk about today will hopefully help you push through those times in your practice. And this is something we can all do, whether you are a super beginner or a very advanced player. These techniques we're going to talk about today are things that really work for everybody. They don't require you knowing any music theory, any of that type of stuff. It's all about ways to sort of break out of that shell of the usual stuff that we practice. So let's jump right in with our first practice approach. For this one, we're going to look at it on a blues. We're actually going to look at a couple different tunes to apply these different techniques, but this first one is going to be on an F blues. We are going to create solos based off of just a single note. Now, when I talk about a single note, we're not literally just going to play one note in the solo. We're going to choose just one pitch. For an F blues, I would probably stick with the root, an F, or maybe the fifth, a C. Those 2 notes are going to fit into most of the chords in a relatively good way, so they're going to work for this exercise. And we're going to create a solo just using one of those pitches and rhythm. It's going to end up sounding a little like this. So why is this an exercise we might want to work on? Very often we are really focused on note selection. Are we playing the right notes that fit in the chord? Are we in the right key? Am I hitting a certain harmonic concept? This gets rid of all that stuff and gets us just thinking about time, just thinking about phrasing, maybe thinking a little bit about articulation. These things really matter to our overall playing. And if we can get some of that other stuff out of the way for a second, refocus here, when we go back to trying to play more like normal, where we might use all the notes we want to, hopefully some of that time practice and phrasing practice is going to be there. Now, the key to making this exercise work is not just to play notes at random. Sometimes when I first introduce this to students, they end up sounding kind of like this. It can really highlight that sometimes we don't have that rhythmic vocabulary and that rhythmic side of our playing very developed, where we can just create good phrases with rhythm. Instead, we want to really focus on, all right, well, what makes a good phrase? What makes us feel like we're in time with the rhythm section? You know, there's a sense of maybe there's some stuff at the beginning of the 4-bar phrase, a little pause in the middle, and then I'm playing into the next phrase. That's certainly not the only way to slice a good phrase, but that's just one good way you can start. The blues is a really great place to do this because it's something most of us are very comfortable on, and it will really work with just this single note idea. Not every tune is going to work like this because some tunes cover a broader harmonic palette. So if you're working on a tune that's maybe a little more challenging, has a more variety of chords, you could do the same exercise just playing roots. But I would really encourage you to try it on just a single note. It is much harder than you think, especially to play something that sounds like a real solo. For any of you who have practiced this before, this is a pretty common exercise. You know exactly what I'm talking about, but give this one a try. You don't have to practice it endlessly. Just try it a couple times to sort of like cleanse your palate in a practice session, and then go back to practicing like normal. See how it interacts with the normal stuff that you're playing. All right, let's go to practice technique number 2. For this one, we're going to look at the tune Blue Bossa, and we're going to challenge ourselves to play as little as possible and still feel like we're getting ideas across. This tune is one many players would go to when they're at sort of that beginning phase of really learning how to like play changes, maybe working on some 2/5s, that sort of stuff. It only has a couple 2/5s in it, so it's very great for that period of practice. But what we can do, because we're so hyper-focused on like playing the changes, nailing the arpeggios, hitting the 2/5s, that we kind of lose sight of actually making music. We kind of have a maximalist approach because we're trying to like fill in all those eighth notes to make these nice eighth note lines. That can end up to solos that feel a little bit cluttered and maybe not super satisfying to listen to. So if you feel like you've reached that point, and at least you have some good command of, playing the changes on a relative level, and you want to think, okay, well, this is starting to be a little bit cluttered. I kind of am repeating myself a lot, or possibly I feel like I only have enough ideas to play maybe one or two choruses of this like very eighth note driven style of playing. Take a step back and say, all right, well, can I play just half as much? Now, it wasn't like I was suddenly not thinking about playing changes. I was really just starting to think about, okay, well, what do I really need to play to indicate these changes? What happens when I go from that C minor 7 chord to an F minor 7 chord? What do I really need to change in my ideas to make it feel like I'm in that new chord, even if I don't spell it out in a complete arpeggio or play an entire Dorian mode or something like that? From there, take it even a step back further. Can I even play half as much as I just did? Really start to think about being economical with your note choices. Now, I might not play an entire solo like that, but just by practicing this, not only am I sort of like freeing up my mind from feeling like I have to fill up all the space and, hit every change and all that kind of stuff, but I've also practiced having 3 levels of sort of activity in my solo. So that's going to give me a lot of mileage, whereas before maybe I could only play 1 or 2 choruses before I sort of ran out of ideas or started repeating myself. Now I have 3 distinct levels. I can maybe spend a couple choruses at that first level, a couple choruses at the next one, a couple choruses at the next one. My solos are going to have a lot more direction. Just going to have some other avenues I can go, which is probably going to lead to a more satisfying solo for you to play and definitely for the audience to listen to rather than just a stream of eighth notes. Cool, finally, onto practice technique number 3. This one involves focusing on a single element to be the basis of your solo. Now, we all do this when we practice. It's actually a pretty essential way that we work on improvisation. Maybe it is working on arpeggios, or maybe it is working on a 2/5. It might be something like, all right, I'm gonna play this tune, and I'm gonna see if I can play the arpeggios starting from the 3rd of each chord. Or maybe every time I get to a 2/5, I'm gonna plug in a specific lick I've been working on. That's essential practice. If you're not doing that already, you definitely should be. This takes that and twists it a little bit. Rather than thinking about kind of the melodic or harmonic things that are so common for what we practice as improvisers, we are going to choose a musical component and focus just on that. This might be things like dynamics. This might be things like articulation. This might be things like range. And using that as sort of the center point of your solo. Now, this does require that you have a little bit of command over playing the tune that you're working on. We're going to look at the tune There Will Never Be Another You. And so you do have to be able to navigate the tune relatively successfully to do this. But again, it's a way to edit your playing and sort of change it up. Again, to cleanse that palette instead of thinking like, oh my gosh, I got to get all these 2/5-1s, or I'm working on this cool like diminished dominant, like where can I plug this in? It's all about, all right, I'm going to take a step back. How can I use dynamics to build my solo? Or maybe trying something where you focus on articulation. Maybe you really dig into, am I really playing legato? So important when we're playing swing that legato is happening. And so really go almost overboard with that, that's really like the central point of this chorus. Not only are these approaches going to help change it up and hopefully get you out of the little funk you might be in if you've been practicing a certain concept for a time period, they're also going to give you different directions to go. It's nice when you're playing to just be able to think, all right, well, I'm tired of just playing changes. I'm just going to play 2 loud notes, see what the rhythm section does, and just wait and see how they respond. Or maybe at the beginning of a solo, rather than just coming in with your favorite 2-5-1 lick or whatever, you say, all right, I'm going to play 2 really short notes and just see what happens. You'd be surprised how much the rhythm section, as soon as you give them something to kind of play against, they're going to like perk up and give you new ideas, and it's going to make that whole interchange much more effective. Now, these 3 practice approaches are not going to replace practicing scales, practicing arpeggios, practicing long tones, morning tunes, any of that kind of stuff. It's not about that. These are about supplementing the things that you're already doing to sort of make you a whole musician and make you a complete improviser. I guarantee you, most of the people listening to you do not care about 2-5-1s or arpeggios or diminished dominant licks. They care if you play with some feeling. They care if you play with some interest, if you grab their attention, have some variety in your soul, if you play with feeling, if they can feel what you're playing versus just sort of being able to transcribe it and think, ooh, that's a cool lick. We as musicians love that, but many audience members are not necessarily moved by that. So try some of these things in your own practice to change it up a little bit. They're probably not going to be the main thing you work on, but try them for 5 minutes on a given tune. See what they do for you, and especially if you do a couple of them over a couple weeks, you might find it changes your playing for the better. All right, we'll see you in the woodshed.